going live again. And just a quick introduction, if you've never met me before, never heard of me, my name is Charmaine of Holding Space. Hi Liv, hi Joe. I do, through Holding Space, I assist others in their soul journey, their journey back to discover themselves. And how I do this is I do Akashic Record readings for people, and I do deep hypnosis for people to allow them to connect with their truest selves. And in doing these services, I come across interesting people, and I love stories. And so this Soul Explorer Spotlight series is an opportunity to share people's stories, people who are doing the brave work of, again, exploring themselves, transforming themselves, and really living their stories. And so, so today I have a special guest. His name is Chris. Let me bring him on. Let's see here. Okay. Where is Chris? There's Chris.
Hey,
hi, Chris. Good morning.
Morning.
So the reason why I wanted to speak with Chris today was because in the readings that I do, typically the people who come to me for reading are, I guess there's a stereotype of people who are into New Age stuff. And, you know, it's not usually somebody who's from a technical background. And because for me, I think there's a perception that spirit or, you know, spirit is kind of like the antithesis of technology. So they're opposing worlds. So people who come to me usually are, you know, they don't have that technical background because sometimes logic and the quote-unquote woo-woo are two, you know, opposing worlds. And so when Chris came for a reading, which we'll get into in a little bit, but when he came for a reading, I was interested to see, I guess, what his experience or his understanding would be from a technical point of view. So, so Chris, let me have you introduce yourself. And also give a little context into how, I guess, we crossed paths, if you'd like to talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one, I'm excited to have this conversation. It's going to be a strange one for me, I suppose, because I haven't never.
Every conversation is strange for me, so don't feel.
Good. I mean, it's strange because this is an area and a topic that I've actually never really, I think, talked about publicly. And it's something that's definitely in the early stages of being figured out. And so I think I'm in just consumptive mode. So anyways, by way of background, you know, I kind of think of myself as like a product designer, as a technologist, someone who's been in Silicon Valley for almost 15 years now, if you can believe it. And I've had the privilege of working for like big tech companies like Google and Uber. I've worked on developer platforms, so ways that other people can use those companies' products in their products. I've been a UX designer, so I've designed a bunch of technology things. I've also built communities, and you know, just I think have generally been interested in the use of technology for social purposes, for connecting people, for helping them to communicate, to express themselves, and I find myself in an interesting moment, I guess, just because like I'm sort of going through this, I suppose ever since I left Google, which was in 2013, I've kind of been in this like reformation process, or this, what do I call it? I guess it's part of an odyssey, I think. Because up until that point, I knew exactly like what I was supposed to do with my life in a way. And it was all about work and all about professionalism. And when I left, you know, one of the things that I'd gone to Google to work on was trying to essentially take on Facebook and make sure that like the internet stayed this open platform for many people to use. And anyways, ironically, or not ironically, but tragically perhaps, Google both kind of lost the battle and also we lost the war. And so I left not knowing what I was supposed to do next. And I think that's when I started to really question myself and question things that were important to me, question how I showed up in the world, how I could be present for people and what that was like. And this has been kind of the journey I've been on since.
Yeah. So for people who just joined and maybe might be confused about what we're talking about, you know, I guess for people who follow Chris, you know, who is expecting maybe a very technical conversation, we are talking about how technology and, I guess, spirit work together. So we'll be talking, and that's the reason why I wanted to talk to Chris, is because typically people don't think of those two things as mixing. So we're exploring that. And as Chris said, you know, he was saying that he's new to this, so he's a little uncomfortable talking about it. But that's why I want to talk about it.
Awesome.
So if we can lean into that discomfort, maybe everybody's discomfort, and just see where this conversation goes, you know, that would be awesome. And thank you again, Chris, for participating, because I know it might be hard to come from that place where, you know, you're asked to speak and you're not too sure how the conversation's going to go, maybe. But yeah.
Well,
so
on that point, though, and I think it's actually worth just even trying to understand why it's awkward or weird. You know, at these like kind of fissures between different, you know, realms of knowing, there's a lot of interesting insight that can be, I think, discovered. And I think for me in this case, like you say, like logic and reason and rationality and materialism is often, I think, where a lot of, at least technology has spent the last decade or longer focusing on, right? Everything's sort of based on silicon, silicon's based on sand, and, you know, sand is sort of a mote of, like, you know, the universe sort of stuff, and it's very physical, and it has a set of properties that behave in a consistent way. And I think when you move into the world of spirit or spirituality or kind of other ways of knowing, it's not easy to reduce down to a scientific, you know, method or approach. The crazy thing, though, I guess, is I've been learning more about like quantum theory and consciousness and other types of just things. You know, things are just sort of these elaborate probabilities, and we just don't have the ability to compute them yet. And so it seems to me that if you get up to that higher level of possibility, then these other ways of knowing are not actually that antagonistic if you know how to weave together different types of stories.
yes. So I guess it's a matter of perspective, you know.
Yeah.
And on some level, all perspectives are valid. You know, the materialist perspective is valid. The spirit woo-woo is valid, depending on how you look at it. And the combination that they can both be valid at the same time and play together is also,
you know, so it's funny. So my friend Ben Grant just showed up. Hey, Ben. Ryan. So, you know, I guess what we're talking about is, I guess, tech and spirituality. Trying to think about how these things come together based on both my own experiences recently and then also the kind of stuff that Charmaine does in her business. And why, you know, I think what Ben does that's interesting is he runs a site called Daily Overview. And what Daily Overview does is it's both, you know, I think it's either a Tumblr, but it's also available on Instagram at Daily Overview. It provides all these amazing both satellite and drone images, like, of the world and of the planet. And he was inspired by essentially these astronauts having this experience back in the 70s called the overview effect. And in the overview effect, essentially what happens is astronauts go up in outer space and they get a view of the world that no humans get, you know, even from like airplanes sort of flying over. And you realize all of a sudden how small and insignificant in the universe like humanity really is. And once you have that perspective, that sort of changes your whole approach. And from that view, things like Earth Day and so on started. So when it comes to thinking about like this conversation, to me, that's sort of adjacent, right? Like what Ben is doing with the images that he presents is just giving us the way of seeing human behavior and human activity in a way that we don't otherwise get to relate to, and that we don't have the scale to sort of see and understand. And then you see the patterns and you see how it repeats, or you see how we organize ourselves. And it, you know, on the one hand puts you in awe of what we're capable of doing, but then it also puts you in awe in what we're capable of doing. And maybe gives you a different sense for the responsibility and opportunity that we have to set things off in a better direction.
Yes. So, and again, that's why I want to talk about that, to open up all that possibility, you know, like the more that we explore and the more that we're willing to get into uncomfortable
Mhm.
conversations and exchange ideas, the possibilities are exponential. So we just build off of each other's ideas, and as long as we're sharing. So that's the point of this conversation.
Totally.
So I'm glad you're a willing participant. Thank you. So you mentioned, questioning, I guess, your I don't want to say purpose, but what you're here to do
Mhm.
after leaving Google. Um, what was your first experience or maybe question that kind of led you to look into spirituality? What was your first quote unquote spiritual experience? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think even just the way, or thinking about how you define or understand spirituality in general
Mm-hmm.
is, it was always very foreign to me. I think it was a term that I used because I knew I wasn't religious,
Mm-hmm.
um, but I would say that I was spiritual, but I didn't actually have a definition for what that was. It was sort of like a placeholder. And I think in the last several years, I've just had maybe more and more experiences that are a little bit inexplicable, where a couple things happen. One, there's just a set of things that repeat, or experiences that I see, or alignment that happens, or where I started to think about the universe conspiring like in my favor, and that sort of changed my attitude, and sort of reinforced my general optimism anyways. And some of the things, for example, that I've contributed to in the world have gone on to be just much bigger than I ever would have anticipated or thought. And it came from sort of this idea of kind of giving things away and joining this larger community and consciousness, on the internet. And so whether that was something like, the hashtag, or like the co-working community and things like that, putting stuff out there and then seeing them grow. I mean, my spirituality in a way came from this idea of abundance and giving things away, like from the very beginning. And I think abundance is something that's more commonly thought of now, or it's like more trending now. But when I got involved in the open source ecosystem, it was a completely different economic model. It was a way for people to contribute things that they thought were meaningful and valuable in the world, without necessarily looking for pay. And the internet provided this network in which you could find other people to do the same things. And so, again, I guess, growing up, my parents would take me to like, church on like Easter and things like that. And, my dad also, played organ in like the church. But I never really felt connected to those things, because in those ways, there's sort of these stories that have been written, but I didn't really relate to in terms of how they apply maybe like to my life. And I, even going to like Sunday school or something, it just seemed sort of, abstract and a little bit rigid. And it's, given that I'm a very curious person, I ask a lot of questions like, well, why do they think that way? Why do they write that? Like, why is there that rule? Why do you do these things? And so I think religion in that way, given that it's all about kind of restricting the things that you might want to be able to do, I needed a spirituality or something like that was a lot more expansive. And anyway, so I guess my first spiritual experiences were just kind of seeing so much serendipity in the world. And in fact, the first co-working space that we started was about accelerating serendipity. It was about putting people in alignment in a path in the universe where they could actually connect, and meet each other. And as a result of doing that over and over in my life, it's only come back to me, in this like amazing way. So I suppose this is how I've tried to make the world a little less confusing and more meaningful.
Yeah, I know serendipity feels very. That's one reason why I think the universe is somehow technical, or maybe there's like an artificial intelligence behind it, is because it's so perfect. If you
Well, it's
really
all
look.
math.
Yeah.
If you go far enough out there, right? Like, we just haven't found the equations yet. I think it was I forget the person's name. He did a lot of good stuff. It was Descartes or something. He and it's horrible because it's the internet. So someone on the internet will find this out and tell me what the right answer is. But anyways, he went off, to try to explain the movement of the planets or something, and it turned out that the math didn't exist yet. And I mean, it's not that the math didn't exist; it was there. They just didn't have the language to actually write it down and describe it, to other humans, and so it had to be invented. And so in a similar way, this is why, like, when I think about, whether it's serendipity, like, what are the calculus or calculations for serendipity? Well, if you have a calculation where you count your time over a period of millions of years, then you could actually see these things repeat, and then you could actually build a formula for that. But given that, the human lifespan and the human ability to remember things only exists within, 60 to 80 to 100 years, that makes it hard for us to even conceive of these types of problems. Taylor asked, what are we talking about? Taylor, we are talking about technology and spirituality, and I suppose different ways of knowing.
Yeah. So I don't know if there's a way to like pin, I don't know. But yeah, so for people who are just joining, spirit and technology. That's the topic. Yeah. So, and I love how you described how, there's, it's not that we invent science. I saw a meme the other day that said something to the effect of like science. I forgot how it's worded, but basically the way I see science is it's like a journalist or a biographer following spirit, because spirit will do what it's doing, whether somebody's looking at it or not. Your reality, is doing what it's doing, whether somebody's documenting or creating a formula or not. It's just, has science caught up to documenting, what spirit is doing? So,
well, in a way, like, and I think about this a lot, because I grew up doing a lot of like art, and like you can draw things based on what you see. In other words, the positive surface or the positive plane, or you can draw things based on the negative space, the stuff that's not there. And Alan Watts also talks about this concept that he uses called the grid of words. And to me, this was like so revelatory to sort of understand what he was talking about, which is that if you imagine all of the words that humans have created, and there's quite a few, and then you imagine like graph paper, like with dots on it. And you imagine that all of the human words that exist, all of our language, or or labels for things, exist in those dots. There's actually quite a bit more negative space in the not dot space that hasn't been defined or hasn't been labeled by us yet. And so I think in a similar way, right, like you say, we, if scientists are sort of journalists of reality, and they're writing the stories to help us understand what they are, and we've come up with different ways of expressing ourselves, and maybe it used to be Roman numerals, or it used to be different types of archaic texts and scripts or hieroglyphics, and then we developed Latin language as a way of kind of encapsulating meaning into strings of characters, and then now we have like emojis and GIFs. These are just different ways of repeating or recording experience in history. I mean, the reason why GIFs are so, I think, useful, powerful, hilarious, awesome, and fun is because they capture a sort of memory embedded in us that is a shared experience between two people, and it triggers that in a very fast way, as opposed to, let's say, writing the full-on description.
Yeah,
so
it has a lot of meaning in its symbolism that is beyond words. Yes.
So exactly. So if you think about, another way to think about that is like a GIF is actually a formula. It's a scientific formula for expressing or inciting an emotional reaction or response between two people. You can look at that and be like, well, that's just as valid as all this science, and all these papers that people are writing, which they've repeated over and over again. It's like, if you look at like trending GIFs and you'd be like, here's like the sentiment that's going on in the world today or something.
Yeah. So, and which kind of leads me to, so let me, how did we, let me go back real quick, because I want to get into our conversations that came from after we connected.
Yes.
But do you want to give some context maybe into how we connected?
Yeah, sure. So, you actually did an interview with Joe, who's here, earlier this week. And so Joe is actually my coach that I worked with for quite a while. She's a dear friend. And she kind of, I guess, I don't know, I'm sure she and I were having a conversation like about this very stuff, and then put us in touch. And, you then did what you do. You brought your service to me, through this like soul reading. And, it's interesting, right? Because like, I've gone through several cycles of what's called perf, or performance reviews, big tech companies or whatever, and they evaluate you on like a number of different like levels and things like that. But it's kind of like insane to imagine getting perf like on a soul level or something. And so this is the kind of thing that you put together for me, doing the thing that you do, which is this kind of, I still don't fully understand it, or how you tap into like this broader sort of understanding. But there she is, she's paying attention. Hey, Joe.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah, so I guess that's kind of, am I forgetting anything? I think that's kind of it, right?
No, yeah. So, was there anything in particular that you were kind of looking for, or did you have any questions about yourself that led you to want that?
I think what's useful about it, so essentially to describe like what this, because you produce a document essentially, and in this document, it kind of like lays out a bunch of, attributes, behaviors, lessons that you're pursuing, and a bunch of other things that I just wouldn't have ever thought would be, I guess I just didn't have awareness of these things. I think for me, what was useful was just to have things that maybe I knew about myself reflected back. From in your case, like you really don't know me that well at all, and yet the things that came out in this reading were actually, felt very, accurate. And in some ways, it's fine for me to say, well, someone who has like written an assessment of me, these things resonate, these things don't resonate, or whatever. Like I have a couple apps for getting tarot cards. Sometimes I get ones that I want. I'm like, I don't want to read this one. And then like other ones, I'm like, oh, this is like totally spot on. Like I'm gonna like accept this one.
Yeah.
Right. So I guess in that way, it's just like another way of knowing. And I grew up reading a lot of like comic books, and comic books are these fantastical worlds where there's, they have their own universe and their own kind of like sense of themselves. And now comic characters in particular are a lot more, mainstream, of course. Yeah. And what's interesting is that they are kind of like our modern day mythologies. And if people relate to Spider-Man or to Superman, then why is it not possible for us to find other stories or narratives that people write for us that allow us to imagine ourselves as being different than we currently are? So I think, again, like I'm going through this phase in this process right now, like, who am I and what am I good for? How do I make myself useful? And getting this outside perspective allows me to say, oh, like, here's a different perspective. And do I agree with these things? Are they useful? Do I want to use them?
Yeah. So just to give a little context, what I did for Chris, when Chris came to me, is I do something called Akashic Record readings. And for those who maybe aren't familiar with Akashic Records, and this is where the similarities started to come out between spirituality and technology. So I like to see the Akashic Records as kind of like a spiritual internet. It's like an etheric library. And as I was as I tell everybody, when I explain the readings to them, the internet, it's not really a place, right? Even though there's servers and, computers that access it, the internet itself, there's no place for it. But everybody can tap into the internet with a computer, with a connection. And the Akashic Records is very similar. So what the Akashic Records are is it's this etheric library of past lives, lives that we've lived before, and possible futures, timelines of possible futures. So anybody can tap into this field, either through meditation, or some people, they don't even try. They just keep getting flashbacks of past lives. So there is this field of information that we can access. And so the way I do it is I ask a series of questions. So my method is kind of like methodical as well as intuitive. So I ask questions and then I come up with a story, which is what I present to people in their reading. And it goes over your soul characteristics and your life lessons. And so as I was explaining this to Chris during his reading, again, I was using a lot of technical terminology because the way I see it, there is a relationship with how things work in the spirit world and how things work in our quote-unquote real world with tangible tools like a computer. It's just in the spirit level, we don't see the tools. We are the tools. So I am a computer that accesses the internet of the Akashic Records. So there's a lot of parallels that came out from the reading. And again, since Chris has this technical background, after we went over his reading, we were just exchanging like information like podcasts and just kind of like our personal theories about the nature of reality. And again, he brought a podcast to my attention. which is my background is I'm a nurse, and so he brought this podcast to my attention. I don't know if you guys have heard of Z-Dog, but he does these
Z-O-double-G?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he does these usually medical, videos, spoofs, which is really funny. And then, but this podcast that he sent talked about reality and how Z-Dog had his own spiritual awakening and experience. And he referred to reality as iconic, where these concepts and ideas and pictures and people themselves are kind of like icons on a computer that represent this, meaning, just like gifts.
Oh, it's insane. It's totally like, I mean, if you go listen to it, I forget the guy he was talking to in conversation about the nature of consciousness, but it was like, it's sort of summarizes like turtles all the way down. It's like everything is iconic and representational. And, and also I think one of the bigger ideas was that in a lot of traditions, there's this notion of dualism. Essentially, there's like the spirit world, and then there's like reality. And if you've been following like more of the like meditation folks like Sam Harris and people like that, who are neurologists and applying what they know to consciousness and the creation of consciousness, it's actually not. At least I think they're leaning in the direction that there's not this dualism. There's not like sort of like heaven and earth. It's actually all one. And to your point, I think it's like less that you're a computer, maybe more that you have a computer inside you, but more that you're an antenna. And we're all antennas. And so we're tapping into different layers of reality, and our brains know how to synthesize certain amounts or a subset of all the sense data that could be coming in. Essentially, it's like having, I don't know, like, well, any number of the sensors that are being created right now, as part of like smart homes and stuff like that, they're all sensing a very narrow band of reality, just like our eyes take in a very narrow spectrum of the overall light spectrum. And so in a way, we have our computers or, neurons and things like that, that actually take this information, calculate enough information that then we can act on that information to then survive and persist as antennas indefinitely.
Yeah. I went to Comic-Con. It's funny you mentioned antenna because I went to Comic-Con several years ago. I think my son at the time was interested in Teen Titans. So we went to this forum where the Teen Titans, writers and illustrators, they were there, and somebody asked them, where do you get all these ideas from? And so one of them answered, I think one of the writers, he said he sends up an antenna into the ethers and he picks up inspiration and ideas. And I do a meditation that does this too, because I'm like, that is so perfect, because that is really what we do. We are like antennas. We pick up on the field.
Do you know like one of my favorite bands growing up was?
What's that?
One of my favorite bands growing up?
What?
Radiohead.
Ah, there you go.
Why do I bring that up? Okay, because it's like not a big funny joke, but like I guess when I realized that Radiohead as a band name and as a metaphor is about picking up, and actually what I think was so I guess what I appreciated about the lyrics of a lot of Radiohead songs was that these are phrases or snippets from just normal conversations, and it felt like they're snippeting parts of reality and then playing that back. And so I think I don't know, I guess when it comes to like spirituality, this idea, like I feel like there are all these, this is where it gets weird for everyone, I'm sure, but like I feel like there are ways in which I or some greater intelligence, and of course we're all part of the same intelligence, so therefore it's still I as much as it is you, have placed these little symbols throughout reality to remind ourselves of things that we previously figured out about reality. And so when you come upon it and you re-trigger it, you're sort of having a memory of yourself, of a thing that you once knew or experienced. And so this conversation right now, as you're telling me about the Teen Titans and the antenna in your head and about the computers, is harkening back to this band that I created, eons ago called Radiohead, to remind myself of this thought that we're all tapped into this greater consciousness.
Yeah. We leave like little clues
Exactly.
for ourselves.
All right, continue. You were talking about Z-Dog.
Yeah. So yeah, Z-Dog, that one blew my mind because here he is. I think he mentioned Dr. Hoffman. Dr.
Yes.
Hoffman is the one who came up with this concept that reality is iconic. And that's really a sense of reality that I've always thought of, but couldn't explain. So hearing hearing them have this conversation, and not just have a conversation, but hearing that Dr. Hoffman is actually testing, you know, like trying to prove, when you're talking about formulas to explain reality.
Right.
Here's somebody who's trying to come up with these formulas to explain this theory I've had in my head. Kind of blew my mind, because I couldn't fathom of how somebody could prove that. But I'm so glad that there are
someone's working on it. Yeah,
yes,
right.
And I don't have to worry about it, you know.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so that concept of us being in a hologram, or us living in a hologram.
A hologram or simulation? Simulation. Right?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I my belief, or the way I see reality, is that we're all in like a supercomputer simulating all these infinite possibilities, and this computer is churning out all these scenarios, different ways of being, which is why.
So what is a computer then?
I don't know.
Oh. See, I feel like thinking about a supercomputer actually is limiting. Like the metaphor to me is about simply like processing, I guess, you know, like it's a set of logic gates, and you're passing electricity through it, and it's, like you say, maybe it's doing a simulation, it's doing all the simulations, in which case we live in the multiverse, in which case all of the possibilities are always being run at all times, and then time becomes cyclical, and then it just kind of like becomes like this like mush, and then you're like, well, that doesn't sound that interesting. So I guess maybe that's why you have to invent time, because you have to have a way of actually being able to step through the simulation as it's being run, but then to also be in the simulation to experience it, and then that creates a whole different level of needing to know, and then it gets complicated.
I mean, I don't think there's a point in creating simulations if you can't experience, or, you know, like get the data.
Well, but that's the question, right? Like, I mean, that's what machine learning and AI is about. Like, it's about actually doing millions and millions of permutations. I mean, like if you look at like the deep dream stuff, for example, where they're running Google image search algorithms, but in reverse, and they're actually generating images from the computer, right? That was all going on beforehand. There just wasn't an output. There wasn't sort of like, you know, another kind of antenna that goes into the machine learning algorithm and plucks out little snippets of what the computer is thinking in that moment. And once they did that, we were like, oh my God, like the way it sees things is totally different than the way we do. Like, what the hell is this? And then it became like this interesting trend, and now you can pass your own art through it, and then it sort of, you know, modifies it and adds like dogs and weird sausage things. And anyways, you know what I mean? Like, so I guess what I'm saying is, well, I guess I was asking the question about what a computer is, because to say that we're all a simulation living in a computer feels almost too primitive. Because we have to sort of exist in this quantum reality, and I think that the fact that quantum computers are now being built is super interesting, and it's even beyond my, you know, concept, like my understanding. But the point is that, you know, in binary computers, where you have something that's either on or off, right? It's either a 1 or a 0, and you can essentially extrapolate all sorts of algorithms to essentially reverse engineer what a string of these 1s and 0s means, or what it represents. What's different in a quantum computer is that it's actually both, and you're measuring probabilities, at least again, this is as I understand it. And so if that is the case, and everything is, again, a probability, then the depth of reality is much deeper than we can even fathom, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Sometimes,
so we're on the same page.
Yeah. So on that technical level, like, that's beyond me. I can't even, quantum computer, I don't even know
what I'm talking about. Let's get back to something else. Yeah.
But that feeling that you say where reality is much deeper, I get a sense of that when I'm in the shower. I sometimes get not really maybe a vision, but sometimes when
Is that where you do your readings? Is that where your readings happen?
No.
Oh, okay.
That's where most of my connection happens, in the shower, because I'm so relaxed. But sometimes I get scared because if I really think about the levels, if I really go there, if I let myself drop in the rabbit hole, it makes me nauseous. Like, it's like looking down a chasm, you know, this
in your mind.
Yeah.
By the way, just to catch everyone who's just joining, like, we were talking about like tech and spirituality, and we've, you know, kind of gone down a deep path, but that's where we're at. Okay, continue.
We're just saying right now. we're just playing. So if you guys want to listen, listen. If you don't, it's cool. Leave. But we're just playing right now. So, spirit and technology. Yeah. So, it's kind of like, you know, Inception.
Yes.
You seen that movie? Like,
Sure have.
there's so many levels. Like, if you look down, or for me, my experience is like,
why is it down? Why is it below you? Is it like, is because I would think if you get like vertigo or something, you are looking down, like you said, like into an abyss.
Mm-hmm.
So what is it about your orientation that presumes that the rabbit holes are below you as opposed to above you or any other direction? Because wouldn't that help you sort of feel like you're not going to fall as much? I don't know. Like to me, this sounds like a physical experience that you're having inside of your mind, and I'm like, how do you like in dreams sometimes, like when you have like a waking dream, or what? No, not a waking dream. The well, when you're awake inside your dreams, whatever that's called,
like a lucid dream?
Onomatopoeia or something. Yeah, anyways.
I've heard that word before, but I don't know what it means. All I know is lucid dream. It's not lucid
dream? Lucid. No, it is.
Okay.
It is. That's I was using the technical term. Yeah. Anyways.
Okay.
All I'm saying is, if you can flip the perspective, in fact, that's sort of what they do actually in Inception, isn't it? Where like the whole, like the room starts to like move and everything starts to, reality starts to like, well, anyways. So we're talking about your gaping void in vision in the shower.
Well, I don't know why it's down, but that's just the sense that I got. That it's just that there's so many levels that thinking about how many levels there are is just mind-blowing, and the depth of it made me nauseous. Like, so when I dropped into that rabbit hole, it's...
How do you control that then? How do you control that experience?
I have to pull myself back here.
I see.
So
okay. Back into like the physical reality?
Yeah, and I have to, because if I don't, I get really anxious.
Yeah. Okay.
That, you know, it's kind of like swimming. It's so vast that I don't know how to explain it.
So, I mean, actually, well, again, like, I would say that a lot of my time is spent trying to figure out reality. And so in a way, like, these planets are necessary to have sort of a grounded space in which we can kind of exist. Because in fact, if we were experiencing consciousness or the cosmos directly, it would be so overwhelming. You know, like you think about, is it Galactus or something? I don't know. It's the big guy from, you know, the current Marvel movies or something. Anyways, that guy. You know, you think about like that experience, like the Watcher. You know, the Watcher. He's like that bald guy. You know, he's like, anyways.
Watches everything.
For people who don't, you know, follow comic books, they have no idea what I'm talking about. But like, just if you think about what that experience must be like, and how you do have to sort of expand yourself, and it gets exhausting. You know, you think about like Superman, right? Superman like can hear everything all the time. Like, how do you tune that shit out, right? You have to have like super ears and like super like a supercomputer just to like not listen to things. I get distracted just right now on a fucking Instagram live video, right?
Yes.
So you can imagine like if you actually had access to, like, as you say, the depth. Of course, it's like debilitating and confusing.
Yeah.
Okay. So, anyways, sorry, I keep.
So yeah, that's why. But there are moments where I do kind of lose myself in that, and then I have to come back in. But you know, just the concept of, and that's why the theory of reality being iconic.
Yes,
that Dr. Hoffman was explaining kind of makes sense, because I think in that theory, he's saying it's iconic because if we had to figure out what was behind all the little icons, you know, like the mechanism of what goes behind our reality, it's just too much. So it's kind of like our reality is like a very simplified version of, you know, the complexity of reality. But,
well, you know, to put it a different way, right? The other way that I think about it is like, well, if you wanted to create creatures that could, let's say, interpret or connect or sense different structures or layers of reality. Let's say if you're like, you know, a universal creature or something like that, or you have that ability, like what would you create, or how would you do it, or what aspects of reality would you want to allow this thing to like sense, and for what purpose? Like our fitness function basically is that we need to see a subset of reality, again, in order to persist, in order to survive. And the way in which we hit, and this was actually, I think, part of the Z-Dog thing that I thought was so interesting, was like, there is no such thing as objective reality. There's only subjective reality. Reality only exists within each of us as it's experienced. And we take in the maximum amount of information that's useful for us to procreate or to survive or to continue on. And so this is why delusions are actually very useful. In fact, there is no such thing as like a negative delusion per se if it is supportive of, you know, you surviving. But then of course there are maladaptions if the fitness function is survival for as long as possible. If there's a different fitness function, which I don't know what it would be, but I'm sort of thinking about people with like, you know, mental challenges or problems, or people who have, I mean, you see people who are talking to themselves a lot, and they're clearly having a set of conversations that other people are not tapped into. What is the adaptive benefit of someone like that? Are they able to actually have several simultaneous conversations at the same time, but trying to engage someone else in those conversations in reality is just too much for the other person. And so they can only do it within their own minds. And so then they're having conversations with themselves, and you're like, well, that seems very maladaptive given our reality and given our individuality of I don't know, like, you know, humans moving around and doing things. But in fact, this is how it is when we go online and we're like talking to people through like chat messages, and we're having like 5 conversations at the same time. So we just have different ways of evaluating these behaviors, and yet there could be a benefit of these different sort of mental structures and mental strategies. We just don't know how to use them yet.
Yeah. Well, I'm a nurse, so in a way I combine science and spirit in what I do too, because, you know, being a nurse is very technical, you know, medical, and then the things that I do outside of work is not based on science yet.
How do you reconcile those things, or how do you fit the gap, right? Because on the one hand, you live in the physical plane, and obviously you're treating patients, you know, on like the medical level, but then you have this other sort of other way of knowing and this other kind of way of sensing. So do you see these things? Yeah.
So for when I first got into spirituality, one of the first things that I learned was Reiki. I don't know if you've heard of Reiki. It's energy healing. So my purpose into researching spirituality more was to heal people. So when I learned Reiki, I wanted to heal the world. So I wanted to be the savior. But
don't we all?
I learned that, you know, over the years, I've learned that one of the biggest lessons is that even as a nurse, I see this, I can't heal other people. Other people have to heal themselves. What we do in medicine is just a supportive, just buys time. It's like a Band-Aid. And the Band-Aid is buying that person time for them to figure out what they want to do with their life, if they even want to continue with their life. And so I noticed patterns in people's thinking, like people with heart failure. They have a very specific personality trait. They are very anal. They are very, like, they're kind of OCD. Like if you touch their tray, they will, you know, they'll be like, no, my water has to be here. And they manifest physical symptoms that reflect their misalignment, I guess, in thinking. So as I learned all of this stuff, I could see it in my patients. And so I would just talk to them, you know, and I no longer went from a point of view of trying to save them. Instead, I would just simply talk to them. Like, you know, talk to them about their life. Are you happy with your life? And the Reiki that I learned, sometimes I would use it for patients, but it didn't become something, an active way of healing. It's kind of like within me, like just me being me and being around my patients. Their heart rate goes down once I get them to relax. So I could see how you know, even if I'm not talking to them about Akashic Records, you know, spirituality doesn't have to be, you know, new agey. It can just be you and how you interact.
So it sounds, I mean, in a way then it sounds like one of your maybe capabilities is just like your presence, and you have maybe like a healing or calming presence. And so for especially people who are more prone to being a little more like tightly wound, it allows them to maybe have a little bit more maybe self-permission to slow down or to like relax a little bit. Right?
And so having these, you know, technology again, you know, having these instruments to see how the responses of me talking to somebody, their heart rate going down, their blood pressure going down, their breathing is slowing. So for me, that became kind of like an experiment. Not experiment, but you know, like I get to put into practice what I feel is true and can help. And even though it's not medicine per se, I can see it in technology. You know, like technology is a tool that is assisting me in that moment as proof, you know, as something visual and tangible that what I'm doing and how I'm talking to somebody and how my demeanor too. Because if I come into a patient's room and I'm flustered, their heart rate goes up too. Like, you know, your energy is felt.
Yeah.
So in that sense, that's how I integrate it. And which is why I kind of had to do a switch in my role at work, is because I don't want to help people when they're already at their deathbed. I want to reach people before that. I want to help people live instead of help people die. Although dying is fine, you know, like it's a choice. I believe it's a choice. But I want
dying,
to get
like dying itself is a choice?
That's what I believe.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, so on some level, I think it's like a soul choice that, you know, and also if people keep choosing to not be themselves, that's in a way, they're choosing not to be here. Like, I don't want this life, you know, if they keep choosing not to be their truest self.
Well, it's a different way to say that is that there are many ways to die, I suppose. And one of the ones that's more easily to detect is the death of the corporal body, as opposed to perhaps like the spirit or the personality or, you know, like just your desire to show up for yourself, right? One of the things that Joe just asked actually was about how I guess we can maybe unite or bring together tech and spirituality, how we can use one to access the other and vice versa. So what do you think?
Yeah. So you know, again, another reason why I wanted to talk about this is because people see technology as opposing spirit. You know, like they say, oh, the phones, everybody's on their phone, taking away from connection, or even kids, they're on the TV too much. Or even there's this fear too of artificial intelligence, you know, Terminator, like technology is going to take over. Yeah, like there's this conflict between what's considered artificial intelligence versus organic consciousness. And I think there's kind of like a component there. I think they mirror each other because like we were talking about, you know, the Instagram algorithms, people are so worked up about it's not linear, it's not, I want it chronological, and I want, you know, and that kind of reflects our view of reality before, where time is linear. This, you know, there's it's flat, you know, like you can access it wherever you want. But with algorithms now, it's not linear anymore. It's based on the energy that you put out. What you keep clicking on, what you give your attention to, is what is shown to you. And so I think that's how reality is now, and we're realizing that what we give attention to, whether it's quote unquote good or bad, what we give attention to in the world is what shows up in our reality. It's kind of like Instagram, you know, like what you keep looking at will show up on your feed. So, and also even with, like you said, technology, like texting somebody is kind of like telepathy. Like we're not speaking, we're transcending distance and time. Even if I sent the message today, but you don't read it until 2 days later, I still communicated with you. And so that's like telepathy. So I feel like,
I mean, it's still going through, I suppose. I mean, you're right. Like one of the ways in which we communicate meaning now is through mediums, right? And so we have created this, what we call social media, or medium, as a way of, you know, traversing and sending, as you say, sort of maybe telepathic messages to each other. But it does obviously enter into like the physical space, you know, as a series of electrons, and then it goes to like the network, and then it arrives for you, and then you receive it. But increasingly, I mean, you're right in that one of the things that's being worked on now are like the Neuralink, which is a direct connection into the brain, in order to take the signals that the brain is producing and then put them into a computing environment to then manipulate that computing environment. And so I think that we find it, and maybe this goes back to, and when we talk about technology, it's like talking about computers, right? Like we have to be very careful about what we actually mean by that, because technology could essentially be anything that we create that is outside of ourselves, that didn't exist before. It might be a combination of things. I mean, for example, like an axe or a hammer is a technology. And so what you are able to do when, yeah, sure. I don't know, maybe a tool has more of like a specific purpose in a cultural context, whereas technology might exist kind of, certainly technology can be invented that doesn't have a purpose. And so it might not be a tool yet, right? There's several of these things. Lots of people build apps and no one ever uses them. They're sort of like technology advances, but they're just like not quite solving the right problem. And so they haven't yet become a tool, I guess. Like Twitter was at one point not really much of a tool, and it was sort of just a technology invention or an idea. There's a lot of, for example, there's these 3D like selfie emoji things or something like that are out there now. I think one's called like selfie emoji or something. And you go to their website and they're like, this is a demonstration of this technology. We don't know what to do with it yet. Like, yes, you can use it to like represent yourself, but it's here. So anyway, like the reason why I bring this up is because when I'm thinking about you having this sort of healing or calming presence when you're working with a patient, let's say, there may be a technology that can be developed that allows you to harness that and sort of mirror that energy presence without your physical presence. Like you say, like you're sending a telepathic message, which is just, language being, streamed over so that then I can receive that message and then interpret it and then figure out what to do with it. But if we want to communicate other things that are more ephemeral or harder to, directly transmit, I guess, electronically, like for example, scents, like I think there was work being done on sort of like a scent printer, but that hasn't really been done yet. So we have the ability to, print things for visual consumption, but not for olfactory consumption. And what am I actually saying? What am I getting to? Well, I guess I'm thinking about, like, again, what our definition of technology is, because if we go a little bit broader, Reiki is a technology. Meditation is a technology. These are different techniques for harnessing or focusing these energies that you're talking about in a way that doesn't necessarily lend itself to just like computation or electronics. And so in Silicon Valley, obviously it's Silicon Valley for a reason, we think about things from that perspective. How do we mimic ourselves in these mass producible plastic and metal, like machines? But there's a lot of ancient technologies that we continue to use to this day that we don't think of as technology because they're not made of silicon. And so I guess to Joe's point, I want to be more expansive in the way that we think about what technologies are and what we use to bring some of the spirituality like into our practice or into our experience.
So I guess we just need to change the definition. I mean, like you said, change the definition or change.
Well, labels and words, to me just like, matter,
because I think,
so much, right? In terms of understanding our reality. And so when we think about technology, we think about like apps, that to me is just incredibly narrow and it limits the conversation, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think right now and even if we limit the word technology to just electronics, like computer stuff.
Sure.
It's still really, it's expanding, because we were talking in the messages that we've been sharing the last couple of days, even like websites, websites, when you think of like dating websites, some people will argue that it's taking the connection out and makes it kind of like robotic, or, that I don't think, I guess it's how we use it, just like with everything else, your intention. Because I met my honey through AOL. All of the, I think most of the really meaningful connections I've made were through the internet. And when I was a teenager, my mom was saying like, oh, like, be careful who you meet, because technology was new, the internet was new back then. But I feel like technology does serve a purpose in helping us connect with spirit. Even the readings that I do now, I wouldn't be able to reach half the people that I serve because without technology. You know, it's a tool for connection, and it really does depend on your intention and how you intend to use it. So it can detract if you want it to detract from your experience of reality, but it can also assist. So, and if we use technology as a tool, you know, if that's our definition of technology as a tool, just it's how we use it. So,
you know, one thing that occurs to me as you're talking about this, right? Because again, technology is something that's sort of like outside of us. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, and also I think relates to like this spiritual journey that I've been on, and I think pertains to this conversation, is like, how are we also sort of equipping ourselves, you know, from the inside, you know, or teaching ourselves to understand the technology like within ourselves. Like if we are these antennas, if we are these computers, there is obviously a lot more, you know, research and science and information that's available about our own biases and the way that we behave and our neurology and our biology. And I think that we're starting to sort of understand consciousness like a little bit more. And so one of the things that concerns me is that we've brought a lot of external technology to a lot of people very, very quickly. And we haven't at the same time enhanced their sort of spiritual technology or their own internal ways of knowing or their own sense of selves. I mean, even as unfortunately, you know, I'm watching this conversation unfold, you know, below us here. I'm kind of surprised that, you know, it's like third grade and people are just kind of like roughing each other up. And I'm like, wow, I'm really sorry that, you know, you guys have come here to like, you know, swear at each other and do this like weird thing, like, you know, here. But that to me sort of is an example of the problem, where it's hard to find people who are willing to sort of be open and vulnerable because it's hard to find safe places where you can have a sense for the humanity of the person who's on the other side of these conversations and connections, right? So we've done a great job of disseminating this technology to so many people, but we didn't quite build up the integrity of those individual participants in the network to be net contributors, you know? So for example, like this to me feels like a valuable, you know, exchange with a lot of mutuality between you and I. I don't know that the people who are in our comments are going to end up feeling happier or better or like they've contributed something to the world today, or that they spent this time well. You know what I mean?
Well,
and
that's
you know,
choice. That's the choice.
I know, but I guess my sense is that it's more an impulsiveness as opposed to a choice. Because if it were a choice, you know, you can go play video games and it's probably a lot more, you know, exciting than hearing us sort of have this conversation in this way. So that to me feels like there's this disconnect and this lack of mindfulness and awareness. Like, look at where you are. Like, look at what you're doing. Why are you here? Why did you show up here? What is it that you're getting out of this? And what is it that you're going to bring back to your life that, you know, makes your experience slightly better, slightly more interesting, you know? And so, yeah.
I think, so we're about to end. It's giving us a 2-minute time. But going back to, you made a comment with the thing that you shared a couple of days ago about shining your light. So I think this refers to that. Like we are being vulnerable. We're sharing ourselves right now. And there are people who aren't receptive. They're here, they're engaging some way, but they're not, you know, receptive. Does that stop us from doing this? It doesn't stop us from doing this, because whoever needs to hear this will find it and will hear it. So it doesn't mean we should be selective about putting ourselves.
No, and I think that's the point,
out.
right? To Joe's question, I mean, it's like we have to keep doing this in opposition to the darkness that exists and to, you know, like we're operating sort of like in a world and in a context where we're looking to sort of improve and enhance our experience through a direction. And I think it's just up to us to keep going in that way because of the validity that we see in it. And other people will eventually wake up to it or wake up to this opportunity. And hopefully by then they'll be like, oh, right, there are some examples that I can follow that are already out there.
So again, in closing, I appreciate you going through this, even with all the other stuff. And I know you're about to embark on like a journey yourself. And I don't know if you want to come back and talk about that later, but one of the things I was hoping to ask you is how you're going to put that out into the world. But I'm trusting right now that you're going to just keep shining your light, however way you can,
That's my
and
hope.
to whoever it reaches.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, for sure.
so thank you. Thank you for your time and your energy.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, this is fun.
Thank you. Have a good one. And to everybody else who joined, thank you.